Welcome to the Lipoedema Empower You Podcast with Vanessa and Carrie. We are so glad you're here. This podcast is a space for education, real conversation, and practical tools to support you living the healthiest version of yourself at any age, stage, or size. Whether you are newly diagnosed or further along in your journey, this podcast is a curated blend of lived experience, professional insight, and inspiring stories. Created to bring clarity, hope, and empower you in the choices you get to make.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our Lipoedema Empower You podcast. My name's Carrie, and I'm here with my colleague and friend Vanessa Armstrong, and we're excited to bring to you this new podcast that we've put together. You and I met Vanessa at the recent Lipoedema Australia conference in Canberra, and we'd actually met before that, but we had more time during that conference to talk. And I think it was during that moment that we sort of said, hey, we've both got the same kind of philosophy, the same sort of outlook with this. So how about we do a podcast? Is that kind of your take on this too?
Absolutely. We had also in the previous year had some virtual meetups and sharing of information and things like that as well. So being in person always is helpful.
Oh, absolutely.
Experiencing the conference together and understanding both working with clients in different ways in the community. Yeah, I think we saw a little bit of a need to try and help where we could.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's kick this off, and maybe you can tell me a little bit more about your story, about what brought you to lipedema, because most of us learn about it a little bit later. You know, it's not something that we've known about forever.
For sure. So incredibly strangely, probably 8 years ago, I did the US course from the lipedema for my work. Like never did I think I had it. Okay. I had been going through my own health journey. And I released 45 kilos with a simplified form of keto that I had adapted. I was, came to that because my mom's health was very unwell and she was on oxygen and in a wheelchair and type 2 diabetic and all sorts of problems. And I said, okay, nothing's working. Let's try something really outside the box. And I had been researching for a couple years keto for myself because I was obese my entire adult life. And I didn't want to do something else that failed. So I really sat on the fence and did a whole lot of research well before it was common. And then I asked my mom to do it, and that's very outside the box. It's against what the diabetes educators were telling her, etc. And so we've got nothing to lose. They basically had told her she'd be dead by spring. So, I was asked to fly from Australia back to Canada, and I started cooking for her and sharing information with her, and I couldn't be a hypocrite, so I started as well. And my mom, within 45 days, was off her oxygen, moving better, continued to release weight, and that was 7, 8 years ago now. And I then returned to Australia and released my 45 kilos, and then people started asking me for help. And that's not what I did for work then. I worked in a very corporate career, had been doing that for 16 years. And then, I just started helping people as friends. And suppliers and other people started asking me for help. And I said, well, I can't do this not kind of educated. So then I left my career and I went and studied to be a health and life coach because I felt anyone can tell you a how. But I thought for success, because I had been told how to diet for my whole life. It needed a little bit of a different approach. How can you make it sustainable? How can it be feeling connected to a why that was important? So that's why I chose to do the health and life coach, a little bit of a holistic view to it. So then I've been coaching ladies for about 6 years. In a wide space. So a lot of type 2 diabetics, a lot of women in obese bodies, some not in obese bodies. And I have had clients over the years who have had lipedema and we've had great success. I, again, never thought I had it. ever. I just thought, oh, I've released 45 kilos. My body has a metabolic set rate. Like, you know, I'd gone from a size 22 down to 14, 16 on the bottom, a 12 on top. Pretty happy. Like, and then I started to feel, what are they, imposter syndrome. And why do I still have this bottom half, that some people would go, "Oh, you're a health coach. Like, what's that about?" But I was moving my body. I golf and I played tennis. I had achieved all of that. I was very strong. So it was like I'm okay, but is there something else I should be doing or could be doing? And then my massage therapist, who had seen me and been with me through releasing all my weight, said, "Do I give you these bruises?" And I said, "No, I'm a walking bruise." And then we didn't think anything. And then another time she said, "You have all these lumps." And I said, "Isn't that normal?" And she's like, "No." And I said, "Oh, well, how would I know? I don't go around feeling other ladies' bodies. I don't know this. I've had these lumps for forever." And then my social media feed changed. And that's then how I discovered I had lipedema, basically, because in someone's feed, they were talking about their tree trunk legs. And in my coaching, I reference my tree trunk legs with love, with gratitude. They are what they are. And I always have coached from there. I went and got a diagnosis and proceeded on from there.
Mm. Your story sounds very similar to so many stories that we hear from ladies in our community. Interestingly, my own story in some ways has a parallel to yours that my going back to study nutrition later in life as a change of career was really, again, like yours, that I'd had a whole lot of life experience. In my case, it was helping my children manage some health conditions, but I also thought to actually be able to really help people and to do it professionally, I needed some sort of credentials behind me. So I went back to university. I studied nutrition in my 40s. And that kind of led me to working with clients. And I started to have people come in and say, I think I have this condition. And the first time I heard that, I was like, okay, I'll do a bit of research about that. Again, 4 years at university and never heard the term, heard lymphedema, maybe peripherally, but certainly not in terms of how do we support ladies with these conditions or anyone with these sorts of challenges. And so as I started to work with clients coming in with this, it sort of led me to understand a little bit more about it. I saw pictures. I was like, that's so and so in my family tree. That's so and so in my family tree. Is that me? Probably like many of us, we see something in social media or we hear something and then we learn about what all of the symptoms are and then we can start to see them in our own lives. And I've often said this that I kind of came to the understanding of the condition just as I was sort of heading into that menopausal shift, and that hasn't been kind. So whereas before I might have been able to say, is this part of my story? Now, definitely postmenopausally, I can say, yes, this is part of my story as well. And that just gives me, I would say, even more compassion for ladies in our community that for some of them, it's been something that they've experienced their whole life, kind of along the lines of what you're saying. But for others, it kind of just comes out of the blue, post-pregnancy, menopause, these sorts of things. And then they're left even more confused, like nothing's changed in my life, but all of a sudden my body shape is changing and I'm starting to feel more pain and experiencing different symptoms associated with this.
I even know some ladies who have had like falls, then
Yes.
it's flared from there. Like they had a very active life and they were not in a larger body for most of their life. A couple stories that I have um, been shared, and then they had accidents, and then the lipedema came from there. So
Mm.
everybody's different. Yeah, for me, I always was in a larger body predominantly. I was very active young. I lived on a farm and I played volleyball. I rode horses, but I I can t I just have vivid memories of my mom always saying, "Oh, your dress needs to be a little bit longer to cover your knees."
Mm.
Like I always had the wrapping there. I always had different legs. Um, yeah, but it is what it is. You can't change the past at all. And I can't control anything in the future. All I can control is now and today. And that's what I try and coach is that we do have agency
Mm.
over this. We have it, and that's a fact then. And it's how you move forward to live the best version of yourself.
I love that. I really love that. And I think if we could sum up what we're hoping to accomplish with this podcast, it is that very thing that, there's some things we have no control over, there's some things we have some control over, and it's about making those choices. And, we call this about empowering you because we really do want to empower you to all, everyone, ourselves and others in this community. It's about living and managing this condition and what do we do? So tell me, before we sort of dive into a little bit more around that, tell me what's most surprised you once you started working with ladies with this condition.
Yeah, so I guess what surprised me, so once I had my diagnosis, it's almost like a magnet.
Yes.
Like um because I had in essence lived conservatively, conservative measures for over 8 years. So I released 45 kilos with a simplified keto approach. What I added when I had my diagnosis was some MLD, some circular class 2 compression when I needed it. And food is a superpower in regards to this. And we need to be super mindful
Mm,
that we have the knowledge is the superpower now, and we can't hold on to what we didn't know, but we now know more and we get to make choices.
mm,
And we can do a lot with kind of the inflammation and the pain in the body. So what I found in the communities, was that they were really dark and it was quite depressing. Like I'm happy to give and support, but I actually had to spend less time once I had my own information and learned as much as I could because it's quite dark out there in a lot of the groups. So I was surprised with that there wasn't more positivity, more hope. So that's why, yeah, we've connected on that. That's my messaging when I spoke at the conference as well. I'm trying to put some hope back out there.
yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that would be a similar thing. I get a lot of women coming into my clinic, and of course it's where people initially share their story, and in some ways it feels a bit hopeless. Maybe that's because, we go down the rabbit hole of and we look at pictures and we just assume that's going to be us. But, I'm very much about what can we do? We don't want this to rule our lives, but what can we do? What things can we fit into our lifestyle that are going to make a difference? Obviously, being a nutritionist, I talk a lot about food. You talk a lot about food as well. But there's certainly a whole range of things that we can do to help support this. But if there was one thing I could say, it was it's about looking forward rather than looking back with any sort of regrets. I think we also need to acknowledge that coming to the diagnosis, you know, for some people, it's actually very liberating. They're like, finally, I understand what's going on with me. But then after they've felt liberated and kind of relieved, there is a sense of grief. There's a sense of loss, going back to all of those times that potentially you were told you needed a longer skirt to cover your knees, all of those times that you'd been told, this is your fault, you've just been eating the wrong foods, you haven't been moving your body, all of those messages that we'd been given, even if it was just grandma at a Christmas event saying, do you think you should have a second bowl of dessert? All of those times when we've felt hurt by other people or circumstances around this, it could be in relationships, things are said, and there is a lot of that. And I think we need to allow ourselves to grieve through that. But then, like you say, it's about looking forward. What can I do? How can I support myself? And there's so many different ways that we can do this. And what's one person's path is going to be different to another person's path. And that's the reality of it, right? We're all very bio, unique, I suppose you would say. And I was listening to something the other day where they weren't talking about lipedema, it was another condition. I think it was maybe high blood pressure. It said if you met someone with high blood pressure, you've met one person with high blood pressure. The story is unique to each person, what's driving it. And I think it's the same with this condition. There is no set kind of path or set kind of a trajectory, I suppose, but also unique.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities in a lot of our stories, but everybody's outcomes as well are very different and happen at different times, and how you
Mm.
experience disease is different. One thing that I chose fairly early on, because I had that kind of like mindset training, is I choose to call it personally a condition.
Mm.
Because with a disease, and I work with lots of women who have diseases, right? And also chronic conditions. I feel for myself personally, I have more control over something that's a condition.
Mm.
So if that's just a little bit of a mindset, I know for politics and Medicare, we need it to be recognized as a disease, so no discount there. But for my own living, I choose to manage the,
Mm.
that's one little shift that maybe might help somebody else as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings us to your expertise in this, managing this condition is all about um, the way that we look at it. And that has to do with, even making dietary changes. It's the way that we frame them in our own minds, and the way that we frame the condition in our minds is how we're going to navigate it. And I could just sit and listen to you all day talking about this, because it's the mindset piece is something that we don't necessarily get taught. As,
Not
as children growing up, we tend to just reflect the same as, maybe our parents and other people in our orbit, their mindset, we tend to kind of have the same. So if there's been a bit of I guess if we've been in a doom and gloom environment, that's the way we're going to navigate this as well. But you're really, one of your superpowers is being able to look at that and reframe it, right?
absolutely. So knowledge is our superpower.
Mm.
Food is a superpower in fighting this disease, this condition. But our mind and our heart are right there along in the conservative management basket, I think. And that's what I try and help people to understand the importance, because we believe what we think, we believe what we say. So if we say our legs are shit, they're going to be, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
say my legs, my tree trunk legs, I mean, you can recognize them as you want to recognize them if you want to put a label, like, but they get me to where I need to go.
Mm.
Some days it may look different than the other, but that's okay, you know, because I know now with living conservatively and trialing and erring what works and what doesn't work, and there's no level of perfection. But I know now, oh, tomorrow will probably be a hard day because I didn't move my body today, right? Maybe I had to drive, on Sunday we had to drive 4 hours for my daughter's tennis. I wore light compression in the car, a change when I got there. And I felt my legs much that night. Actually, what I get and I experience is I get a burning feeling in my legs. If I'm not moving, that's my pain and threshold, and it keeps me awake, right?
Yeah.
That essence. But if I move, and this is part of my life now, I move, I don't experience that. If I eat too much sugar, I will experience inflammation. I will get arthritis that comes instantly back into my hands. But I know if I manage that, the things that trigger me, then I live differently, right? So I
Yeah.
get to choose and I get to think of it differently. It just is what it is, because so many people live with different things
Mm.
and manage different things, and it's not a one's better than the other or worse than the other or anything. But I try and approach, and I think in this podcast, we're going to try and plant some seeds to help people with their physical action steps how they can manage. And one of that is the mindset piece. And I choose to think there are no perfect legs, period, right?
Mm,
And everybody has something, right? I have this, but it isn't my self-worth. It's not everything to do with me. I'm much more than the whole shell. And I go about with the information I have doing the best I can. And one day, it's okay for one day to look different than the next. It doesn't mean you've done right or wrong, or you ate something good or bad. It doesn't, labels don't often serve us.
mm, mm. As you were talking, it reminded me of something my mum used to teach me as a little kid. She used to say, whenever I would have a bit of a whinge about something or express concern, she said, "What you fear comes about." And I think that's, powerful. In our condition, we can almost freak ourselves out. And as we freak ourselves out, that releases more stress hormones in the body, and that impacts our condition, and there's a lot that's going on with that. But I think if we turn that around to this message of hope, if we look at this condition with a sense of hope, certainly compassion for ourselves and all of the other things that go along with that, but if we look at it through a lens of hope looking forward, I think we can actually get some positive momentum too. We don't have to be in that what you fear comes about kind of scenario.
Yeah, I try and coach to curiosity.
Mm,
So, lean into what might be possible. Not something that we're entitled to, right? And not something that we fear, but just lean into what the opportunity, what the possibility might be. So we get to make choices. Consistency is what we're after in our choices, not perfection. And then we get to be curious, see what
mm,
happens.
I like that. I like that. Yeah. So we may have people coming along to this podcast that are new to the condition. Some may have been experiencing this for a long, long time. But if somebody came to you new to the diagnosis, what would you say to them? What would be the first thing that you would share?
Well, I guess in general, like I think you as well do like a first consultation, phone call, safe space, Zoom. And I always think that it's important for everybody to be heard and to be seen in that because they've been through a really long journey, probably before they've come to you or to me. And they've seen their GPs, they've seen a lot of people and probably haven't quite been seen and heard. So it's a safe space
Mm,
and that there's hope. There is,
yeah.
and that you do have a form of agency over this at any stage, age, or size.
Mm,
That might look different for everybody. I've had 70 and 80-year-old ladies I've worked with, and they make improvements to live as a healthier version of themselves, what they deem a healthier version of themselves. And again, one day may like look different than the next, but they have hope. Right?
mm,
They're lighter, both mentally and physically.
yes.
And I think that that's really important. And we don't have to rush. We don't have to do everything.
Oh my goodness, that's a key message that I like to absolutely share with people right at the beginning of their journey. I think it's very easy to jump online and to, come up with some lists. And there's certainly those lists floating around. There's a list of, you need to take 20 supplements, and there's a list of all of the things that you need to do each day. And if you do them all each day, there's probably no time for relationships, no time for a job, no time for anything else. They are very extensive lists. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we live with this condition, but we don't want this condition to define our lives. So,
Absolutely.
in terms of making choices, it's often a bit of an experiment, really, to see which of all of the different options has the most promising benefits to you. And that's going to be unique to each person. But try not to let this become and to become your identity. You are a person with this, not this isn't who you are.
Exactly. And I even in other coaching of other conditions, instead of saying I'm type 2 diabetic, it's
Mm,
I have diabetes.
mm,
Right. So we try and put some distance between that. I live with lipedema. So it's around that, we get to manage what we can, what is in our control. So
Yeah.
absolutely, hope is the biggest thing. And I think that's one of the things like we want to give this, podcast series to the community as a little bit of a gift. What will be, for people researching is when you're in that grief stage, it can be quite overwhelming. So this can be a point of reference for people because we're going to bring on some other experts. We're going to share positive women's stories in our community. We're going to highlight them. And yeah, put a little capsule together for people and they can share it with other people if they know that it's someone's curious if they have lipedema or whether they've been diagnosed with lipedema. And then it can be a jumping off board when they're ready to go and go, oh, okay, I'd like to look more into that one aspect or more into the next aspect of conservative management. And
Yeah. I like what you said before. You don't have to do it all at once either. You know, that is commonly what I hear that people feel like they need to start doing everything. So I mentioned that, there's so many choices that we can make. What's some of the choices that you feel are so important to women in our community?
well, just starting with something, right, is important.
Mm,
You don't need to do everything on the list. As you said, there isn't the time for that. So we have to trial and error, build out the toolbox. But one of the things I find, depending on where you are in your diagnosis, where you are in stage, and where you are in your relationship with your body, impacts what people choose. Because
mm,
some people don't feel that they're worthy to actually choose something and stay with it.
very true. I do see that in my client population too, that it's almost like they don't deserve the
Yeah.
time and effort that it maybe goes into managing this condition. So yeah, tell me a little bit more about that.
So working on that space, and hopefully we'll bring that through in the podcast, is when we can work on that heart and mind piece, and when we can work on our identity and our belief system. And if we've come through life feeling that we didn't fit somewhere, or we weren't seen, or we didn't want to be seen,
Mm,
and we don't have an appreciation for what our body has been able to do for us, then it's all overwhelming, the conservative measures in the list. And you may say, well, and I can't afford surgery, and that's not an option for me for whatever variety of reasons. So then there is no hope. And so then they won't do anything
mm,
because there's overwhelm and there's feeling that they don't have control and they're not worthy of a change. This is my lot. This is my life.
mm.
And they won't lean in and just get curious. So that's, I think, something that we'll really be able to help with through the conversations and slightly changing the mindset because everybody is worthy of
Yes.
living, period, and living the best version of themselves at any stage, age, or size. Like, and we shouldn't compare what one person has to the next person at all because everybody's circumstances are different. But what we want to lean into is like, I deserve to take up space, right? There are people in our lives who do love us and see us, and they don't see the legs, okay? They see the person and the heart, and they want us to be here for as long as possible. And they
Mm,
want us not to be in pain,
mm,
right? So when we can understand that we're worthy, and sometimes your professionals and your coaches, they hold that space and encourage you until you get there, right?
mm,
So just starting, pick one thing and just keep going with it. You're not going to see instant changes.
mm. As
But
much as we want to, right?
of course,
But one of the things that I see in this piece is in certainly in a lot of the ladies that I've worked with is there's some really challenging self-talk that goes on with this condition. And I think that goes hand in hand with what you were saying about maybe not feeling worthy, but for some people, the messages that they're giving themselves and the things that they're saying about whether their legs or their body or who they are can also really have a detrimental impact to their progress. And they are almost a robber of the hope that we're talking about. So, as we kind of get to the end of this first podcast, one of the things that we want to do in all of these is give you some take homes, some things that you can start doing. We all love to just sit and listen, and people listen in the car, they listen, when they're out walking. But if we're just listening for entertainment, that's positive. I don't know, have we been entertaining today, Vanessa? I don't know, but if we're just listening for entertainment, that's one thing, but ultimately we want to be able to listen to put something into action so that we can start, continue that journey forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, we will at each podcast episode have a takeaway or an action step, one or two, that people can choose. And
Mm.
they may have resistance to that.
Mm.
Okay. One of the things to be aware of is what we have the greatest resistance to is sometimes our next breakthrough. You know, change is not easy at all. We have to get uncomfortable to create change. But our body, what I call in coaching our critter brain, will always try and keep us safe and in the familiar. So
Mm.
we'll come up with every reason not to try something new because that will prove us right, right? So
Yeah.
if I woke up today and I said I'm going to have a crap day, I will 100% have a crap day because I will find all the things and the circumstances and the thoughts to prove to myself that I had a crap day.
Yes. To reinforce that thought, right?
To
Yeah.
reinforce the negativity.
Mm.
One presentation that was really good at the conference was spoke about pain and the real connection with the brain and
Mm.
our degree that we feel pain. So there was opportunity and research there, if we actually say we feel less pain, we may ultimately down the track feel less pain.
Mm.
Keep telling yourself and reinforcing, I'm grateful for my legs. I'm grateful. Used to call them my bat arms. And then at the first 2 years ago at the Lipoedema conference, somebody referenced angel wings. Well, isn't that just a lovely,
Oh, that's so much of a nicer reframe than bat
yeah,
wings or touch the
beautiful, right?
palms or
Well, our words are super powerful, but we have to continually say them to ourselves. So writing out positive things, saying it, seeing it, all help reprogram our brain and our reactions, our identity, and our beliefs. So you have a takeaway to
Mm.
set. Um,
Absolutely. So probably along the lines of what you were talking about, and I'm just going to say I have this catchphrase: break down before breakthrough. And I think that kind of goes along with what you were saying that, you might get some resistance. Sometimes it's hard to go through these things, but then you move to the next level in terms of what you're doing. But one of the things that I think is really important for us to start just acknowledging and maybe not even making great changes at this point is, but listening to the self-talk and trying to work out whether we are one of those mean girls to ourselves. And if we are, then how do we start reframing that and acknowledge, like you said, these legs provide amazing benefits to me. They get me from where I need to be. They are a great lap for my grandkids to come and sit on, one day. These sorts of things. Is a lot of ways that we can reframe these negative messages we may give ourselves into positive ones. And I think that is a really important piece in our lipedema journey that maybe hasn't been so much talked about. Certainly, I've been working in this community for probably going on 5 years now. I've taught many, many, many courses in things like keto, things like, I'm doing one at the moment, how to navigate social occasions with, dietary changes, these sorts of things. But we don't talk so much about the mindset piece. And I'm really thrilled to be here with you. I'm looking forward to sharing this journey not only with you, but with the listeners. And please, if you enjoy the content of this, please share it with other people. We do want to make this as a living resource, don't we? Where we have a whole load of different episodes. You're not necessarily going to need to listen to them in their order. If there's a particular thing that's interesting to you, once we have a number of these sort of under our belts, then we can, have them all available to you. And you might be interested in compression, or you might be interested in some of the other, moving your body. And we'll be having conversations about all of these things. We also, like you mentioned, going to be interviewing people, having them share what's empowered them in their journey. And this really is about empowering each and every one of you to live the best life that you can. And like you said, at any age, any stage, any size.
Absolutely. My invitation to you is to come back again for the next episode, that you are worthy of the time to spend on yourself, to listen to something or to watch something that may help you reframe living with this disease. You don't necessarily need to take an action right away. That's okay. But over time, there probably will be less resistance. And by being curious, we will see what's possible.
I love it. Thank you. I think that's great. What are we going to say now? Please continue this journey with us.
Okay, Carrie, we made it through our first one.
We survived.
And like, we're not professional, right? Podcasters. We are getting outside our comfort zone to do this. We're doing it from a place of caring and compassion, and wanting to give to the community. So we hope people will forgive any ums or ahs, or we'll do our best to try and edit them out. But again, we're not editors and things like that. But I guess us getting outside our comfort zone to do this is the same of what we might be asking of some ladies to get outside their comfort zone and to lean in and get curious of the different topics that are going to come up over this kind of capsule of podcasts that we're putting together. So thank you for your time. And I look forward to learning more about your journey, because I think also, what you're doing in this space, people really should learn more about as well. You're just released research paper. I think there's more coming. Yeah, so it's super exciting times. And I guess in the lipedema community, it's exciting times as well. And we'll talk more in episode 2 around what lipedema is, what the research is, where that's going, and how we can start to bring in an understanding and simplifying some of the science so that people have a little less overwhelm.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Just one little thing that we probably just want to add is we're going to be sharing a little bit from my nutrition background, from your, health coaching background, but medical disclaimer, always get other advice in terms of this, and your own personal circumstances best. So take the information that we share and put it through the lens of what you already know about your health. If you're taking medications and you decide to make dietary changes, even some of the lifestyle changes, it is really wise to discuss those with your health professional.
Absolutely, for sure. Well, thank you. And thank everybody for listening and watching and spending some time with us. We look forward to seeing you again.
See everyone.
Until next time, keep taking small, empowered steps. They all add up. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love your help in reaching the next woman